was being said, but just repeat one line of David's I wrote down. The time has come for subsidy reform and carbon taxation, close quote. That's a pretty important takeaway, and where I think we're going to be discussing, and where potentially people will be looking back at this day at the Peterson Institute when the IMF said that. I also, though, want to point out, again, consistent with our values and the fund's values, this is research-based. I particularly want to note Carlo Cottarelli, head of the fiscal department, and his team, which I know did incredible work on this project, as well as some of the other country teams. And they've kindly made available discs for those of you who, like me, are scared to download files. I think we have a lot to talk about, and we want to get all of you involved. So let me turn first to Bill Klein and ask for his views as someone who's been studying these issues as well as global poverty issues for so long.
Thank you, Adam. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to comment on the fund's new estimates of energy subsidies. I consider this study to be radical, and I approve its radicalism. In past years, the International Energy Agency has made annual estimates of energy subsidies given by developing countries in such forms as maintaining artificially low gasoline prices in oil-producing countries. These estimates have tended to run to the order of $300 to $400 billion a year, depending on the oil price. They've been heavily concentrated in the oil exporting countries. The fund's new estimates places these pre-tax subsidies in a similar range, $480 billion for 2011. Now, in terms of past policymaking or policymaking politics, the past estimates have tended to point the finger at developing countries as the guilty parties in energy subsidization. The oil exporting countries account for about 70% of this traditional measure of the subsidies. Now what the fund has done is to expand the definition of subsidies to include failures to impose taxes on pollution and failures to collect taxes on energy that are comparable to taxes on other goods. These may be thought of as tax expenditures, like the revenue lost from the deduction of interest on home mortgages. Turns out that when the calculation includes these sins of omission, in addition to the sins of commission, that the broader concept of subsidies works out to be almost $2 trillion, or almost 3% of world product. That's a striking number, considering that the share of the energy sector in global product is probably only 4 to 5% of GDP, the US range. Moreover, the more comprehensive concept shows the industrial countries, the advanced countries, as contributing 40% to the global total, instead of only 3% under the traditional narrower measure. The United States alone, $500 billion, more than 1/4 of the world total. Other advanced countries add another $200 billion. China is responsible for $280 billion. Russia, $116 billion. Iran, $85 billion. India, $81 billion. The broader concept involves the foregone taxes on pollution externalities, what's called Pigouvian taxes. The study uses $25 per ton of carbon dioxide based on the 2010 U.S. interagency review of the damages from climate change. This is about the same price that the Congressional Budget Office arrived at in the path that would be needed for permits that would be consistent with limiting global warming in the 2009 legislation that failed to pass. Now, considering that global carbon emissions are 30 billion tons, failing to impose the Pigouvian tax represents a global revenue loss on the order of $750 billion annually, maybe somewhat lower to the extent that the fund's estimates somehow take account of alternative carbon restraint initiatives. As David said, the implication is that global carbon emissions could fall by 13% if these tax expenditures were removed. It turns out that the other pollution components can be even more important. For the United States, the uncollected Pigouvian tax on gasoline amounts to $1.37 per gallon. Carbon dioxide is only 23 cents per gallon of that total. Traffic congestion is 57 cents. Accidents are 46 cents. Local pollution is 8 cents. Most of the carbon dioxide subsidy is in coal, nearly $100 billion. But oil accounts for $365 billion because these other pollutions add much more than climate pollution in the case of gasoline. I look forward to more detailed estimates by the fund. It would be useful to have the composition of the subsidies for at least the G20 economies. That detail would help bolster these estimates as they are examined. In response to my query, David's colleagues reported back for the United States, the $502 billion subsidy is composed of only $9 billion of pre-tax, $363 billion for externalities like pollution, and $130 billion in foregone VAT revenue. I wonder, however, whether the U.S. tax experts would agree that reliance on income taxes as the system instead of VAT taxes constitutes a subsidy. I doubt it. One also wonders how the gasoline tax, which has a state average of 48 cents per gallon, of which 18 is federal, has been taken into account in calculating the foregone VAT. For Europe, it turns out, if you go through the numbers, there's a tendency for the carbon dioxide emissions multiplied by $25 to actually exceed the Pigouvian tax foregone that's reported in the study, which suggests that somehow the study makes some exemption for emissions trading system or other anti-carbon measures. But in general, fleshing these kinds of details out, I think, would add a lot to the study. A related issue is how the study takes account of regulation as opposed to taxation in dealing with pollution. Is there any credit for fuel standards, fuel efficiency standards, denial of permits to new coal-fired power plants, and so forth? If not, then the externality damage might be overstated. And looking forward, one has to ask, how would good subsidies as opposed to bad subsidies be treated if there were subsidies to renewables that were within the range of plausibility in terms of their impacts? For the United States, at least, the study seems to open a natural avenue for win-win policies, namely the use of carbon and other pollution taxes to address the problem of fiscal consolidation. I find it significant that $25 a ton for carbon dioxide would collect $150 billion a year in the United States, a larger amount than the sequester, so $100 billion a year. Even if 1/3 of the revenue were given back in compensation to the coal industry, for example, or to low-income consumers, a net of $100 billion a year would bring the debt ratio in 2022 from its baseline of 75% of GDP to only 70% of GDP. That could make a major contribution. I hope that in its fiscal studies, the IMF will increasingly emphasize the potential for revenue from action that also curbs climate change. The fund has stressed that there are major improvements in fiscal balances that will be essential in the industrial countries to bring debt ratios back to anywhere near levels prior to the Great Recession. In its efforts in this direction, it could emphasize that Pigouvian taxes would be a desirable way to do this. Now, more broadly, the key question for policy purposes is whether the United States, China, and other members of the G20 actually sign on to the proposition that uncollected environmental taxes represent a subsidy that the G20 committed to remove. I suspect not. That's why this study is radical. It is giving the IMF's international imprimatur to a policy evaluation that many countries, including the United States, have in effect been unwilling to embrace directly in international negotiations on climate policy. I applaud this effort to quantify these distortions, but I suspect it will take a considerable time and much heated debate before it is likely to have much chance of prompting corrective action. Indeed, in the entire study, there is not once any mention of the term, quote, carbon tax, quote, let alone, quote, globally uniform carbon tax, quote. This absence suggests that the fund authors are treading cautiously, probably advisedly so. My other observation on the study is that the case studies and their lessons pertain to the smaller part of the pie, the traditional pre-tax subsidies. It would be particularly useful if in the future the fund would provide similar evidence on how reform is carried out for the Pigouvian taxes, especially those related to climate policy. Overall, I commend the fund for this new study and look forward to future developments in this analysis.
Thank you. You know, when Bill Klein starts talking about radicalism, we're in pretty strong territory here. So going down the street to the true firebrand NGO, let me ask Andrew to weigh in.
Good. Thank you very much, Adam. First, thank you for hosting this. We are delighted you're here. We enjoy a very deep relationship with you guys. Thank you very much. This is a really important report. The fact the fund is doing these estimates in such a careful way, so many countries, is terribly important. They're the 480 billion is very consistent with what others have done. But I think the fact the fund has done them in a very thorough way and acknowledges, by the way, these are probably underestimates for a number of reasons, is terribly important. But the real game changer is what Bill said, the fact that in addition to the regular gross subsidies, you look at the post-tax subsidies is really remarkable. I mean, $1.9 trillion is real money, 8% of government revenues. This is extraordinarily important, and this assumes a $25 a ton price of carbon, which many people would think is an underestimate. So probably the amount of money we're wasting is even greater than the $2 trillion talked about here. And as Bill says, I mean, to some extent the fund is doing, I think, the world a huge favor by paving the way towards 10 years from now having a serious price on carbon. The 6 lessons you draw out, I think, are exactly right. 2 small quibbles. First, you acknowledge producer subsidies, but the tone is very much consumer subsidy. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters for the reason that it's rich countries that mainly use producer subsidies. Maybe it's not so much, but it's $60 billion. That's worth mentioning. But more important is the politics of this. Go to Rio Plus 20 last June, and the countries of the world had the opportunity to embrace the reduction of fossil fuel subsidies. They didn't. Why? Because it was perceived to be a negotiating issue. It was sort of, I'll stop wasting my money when you stop wasting your money. And so it's terribly important that we demonstrate that industrial countries are part of this. And next time there needs to be a case study from the rich countries. I mean, maybe there isn't one because there haven't been any case studies of rich countries addressing their subsidies, but there ought to be because we need to demonstrate that we're all in it together. The other small quibble mentioned by David, though, and it's not a big one, but for the next time, I think subsidies on renewable energy are going to be growing. At the moment, they're about $88 billion a year worldwide, not huge compared to the 500 billion, but nonetheless, they are going to be growing, and I think 40 countries now have feed-in tariffs. That's worth looking at. Are those feed-in tariff rates about right? Are they not? Just a word on the lessons of successful reform, just 2 points in particular. First, on the compensation for the poor. I think it's extremely important what you say. It is astonishing to me that whenever the issue of removing fossil fuel subsidies is raised, politicians immediately say, well, what about the poor? And the answer is, actually, we know how to do it. When I was part of the B20 last year, we presented to the G20 a really strong recommendation to eliminate subsidies. Well, it's very difficult politically. But actually, those of us who have seen it up close know that if you're a smart government, you can do it. I was living in Indonesia in 2005 as a country director for the World Bank, and 3.5% GDP was the energy subsidy. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono says, I will double prices if you can show me how to compensate the bottom one-third. And so we brought in experts from Mexico, from Brazil that had done cash transfer. I remember being in the vice president's house late at night, and he said, how long will it take? We said, well, probably a year. He said, I need it in 3 months. They did it in 3 months. The price of diesel was doubled. The price of kerosene was tripled. Some grumbling among the citizenry, but mainly from people who didn't get the cash subsidy. Worked beautifully. It can be done by smart governments. We need to nail this one because it's just lingering out there. And just because some countries aren't smart enough to do it right, we actually do know how to do it right. This gets to the really important question, I think, which is the data here, especially for the growth subsidies, are not new. But somehow the data are showing that subsidies are not declining. So why is that? I mean, these numbers have been calculated for decades now. And I think if you simplify it, you know, there are two groups of people who protest. There are citizens who go out in the street. We ought to be able to address that. It's overwhelmingly clear that these are regressive, and a good communications strategy exactly along the lines that this report suggests should be able to deal with it. And NGOs, civil society, need to play a much more supportive role. They have been totally, for the most part, unhelpful to date because they haven't been willing to demonstrate actually how the poor can be compensated adequately. But the second group, I actually think is more difficult. It is the business community who actually sometimes genuinely believe that there is a competitiveness argument. I think in this country, very serious business people really believe that a low price of energy is important for competitiveness. Now, this report says, actually, it's not. Actually, competitiveness will be improved. We need to do a lot more work on demonstrating this. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming that whether in this country or any other country, the $100 bills lying on the pavement are huge in number. And the energy efficiency would make this country and other countries much more competitive than the past. The hypothesis of green growth essentially says the existence of an environmental issue can actually help encourage you to do things which would be in your own economic interest anyway. And we need to bring that out much more carefully. Now the question is, will there really be a change now? 135 countries are on record that they plan to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, G20, APEC, AOSIS, and others. There's even a group called the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination, believe it or not, and that has all the good guys like Denmark, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, New Zealand, and other Scandinavian and Swiss-type countries. The question is, will anything happen? And the jury is still very much out on that. Jim Kim has said this is going to be one of his 4 big thrusts on climate change. Christine Lagarde goes to Davos and says climate change is the biggest economic challenge of the coming years. Whether this report remains just a good report or whether it becomes a game-changing report really depends on what we do with it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and we are indeed glad to be on a recurring basis partnering with WRI and look forward to, even without us, hearing more about the Indonesian case, which is very important to study. Robin has been on the front line in the sense of actually seeing what subsidized state-owned oil companies actually have to do and put up with and navigate. So maybe you can give us a bit of a reality check on what all us economists are saying.
Okay. I have a couple of reality checks with all due respect to. I begin by saying that with this gathering of eagles, all these foxes, I'm afraid I'm just a dull fellow. I'm a hedgehog. I just have one big idea, oil and gas. That's what I do. I brought a prop along, which is the New York Times story today says, Petrobras, once symbol of Brazil's oil hopes, strives to regain lost swagger. And if there was ever a case of a company, a world-class institution that 5 years ago was seen as a transformational figure for Brazil, for the developing world, for the oil industry, it was Petrobras. And it was the second largest publicly traded oil company in the world after Exxon and they've been a client for years. They go down and they boast that they're going to soon overtake Exxon. Their market capitalization in the last 5 or 6 years has declined by 73%. They've gone from 72.3 billion to 17 billion. Or no, that's the stock price, was 72 to 17. It's lost to 77%. This is a case of a company that has been plundered by politicians. One of the things I've learned about the oil and gas business is that politicians do not care about oil and gas. They care about the money from oil and gas. And it's a very important distinction. And they have put it to Petrobras in several ways. One, they've insisted that Petrobras subsidize the price of fuel, so you have very low costs fuel, which has encouraged demand, which has forced Petrobras to import more and sell. It's one of those things where you lose money on every barrel, but you make it up in volume. And the volumes are enormous. And so Petrobras is losing money that way, but there are other kinds of subsidies, and that is the huge pre-salt program of the offshore oil development, which would be the largest capital project in the history of the world. The Brazilian industry and government wants jobs out of all of this. And the result is the whole thing has come to a screeching halt. If you look around at national oil companies, and we probably cover them in greater detail, you'll see that, again, there was a discussion of the MENA countries. You have Saudi Arabia is using subsidies. If there ever was a downward gyre, it's Saudi Arabia. They have cheap energy to encourage demand. It is the highest growth for energy consumption anywhere in the world is Middle East, North Africa, particularly the Middle East and the Gulf area. It's cheap energy. It's considered a right. It's being used to encourage industries like petrochemicals, which are not labor intensive. So they're pouring capital into these things. And what's happening is if this continues, there will be less and less oil, and there's no gas at this point, there's no new gas. There'll be less and less oil to export. And so that in the end, if this continues ad absurdum, Saudi Arabia could be in the position where it has substantially reduced its revenues. If you look at China, a couple of points. The Chinese oil companies, they announced last week that subsidies cost them $10 billion last year. That's $10 billion that doesn't get invested in other things. If you look, again, we talked about Brazil. If you look around, you'll see that there are countless examples. And again, the politicians tend to look at state-owned enterprises as kind of toy stores, aside from just the price of fuel. Now, I would like to respectfully submit, and again, the other example of a state-owned enterprise and exporting country has been utterly plundered is Venezuela, where there were two institutions in the state when Chavez came in that functioned, the Army and the National Oil Company. And the National Oil Company they deliver food, they run schools, they run street fairs, they distribute money, and as a result, there's no investment. Foreign exchange generation is plummeting. Oil production is plummeting. Venezuela is a case of in a sense, subsidies of every form, including cheap energy, carried to its absolute worst. And there are countless examples all over the world. There are some good examples, though. And we've talked about Latin America, you talk about Venezuela, and you talk about Brazil. There's another country where production is soaring, and it's soaring because the country embraced market forces. And if I have one criticism of this report, there's very little discussion of market forces. And if there's one thing I've learned in the oil and gas business, this is an industry which is so big that if it is not aligned with market forces, it's not sustainable. And likewise, if environmental programs are not economically sustainable, they will not be sustainable. And then there's one last country that I would, in the Americas, that I would touch on that has been a phenomenal success, which I would respectfully submit has probably not been factored into the funds analysis, and that's North America. We are now, natural gas production is surging. We are approaching our 1994 levels, I believe, from carbon emissions from energy. This was all done because of the private sector. Now, I'm not trying to stand up and be an oil and gas guy and, you know, a good old boy. And by the way, the oil companies should not be mistaken for the Little Sisters of Charity. I'm under no such illusions.
Neither are we, by the way.
What?
Neither are we, by the way.
Oh, good. But the fact of the matter is market forces really work. And you can see in a number of cases where that if governments really understand markets, whether it's in electricity, whether it's in production of oil and gas, whether it's to drive consumption, I would argue that that's where the transformation can take place. And that's what happened in the United States. What happened in the United States was government had virtually nothing to do with it. It was independent oil and gas companies saw an opportunity driven by high natural gas prices, and they responded. And if you can set up systems in other countries, I think you will see innovation. You will see funds being made available for investment. One of the problems with a lot of government policies in a lot of countries right now is you can't get a return on investment. Why would anybody invest if you can't get a return? So give them a return. And also that consumers aren't stupid either. And if they have alternatives and incentives, they will respond accordingly.
Thank you, Robin. And just to be clear, we have friends in the oil companies, and no one who speaks in favor of market forces and aligning with market forces is unwelcome here. That is always.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, no, I just want to
But
be very clear.
it really doesn't speak to market forces.
No, I want to be clear about that. I think David wanted to just make a quick response to some of the things the panelists said, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? I think these were great comments. I appreciate the compliments. We are okay with being called radical once in a while. To Bill is always a very careful reader, and you raised some very good questions and subjects that we certainly can look into further. I did want to say, on Robin's points, I think I agree with the substantial part of your presentation. We certainly don't mean, I started by mentioning that for years people have, when they think of export subsidies, they think about oil-producing countries that provide either free or very cheap gasoline or other kinds of energy. We're not holding back in saying that those are undesirable and damaging subsidies, and we certainly mean to focus on that. As far as market forces are concerned, we're not very often accused of being anti-market forces, and I think it's fair to say that for the most part, this report is all about promoting market forces and trying to suggest that governments should back away from interventions that have prevented them, but with the important caveat, and this comes back to a lot of the subjects that Bill spoke about. That works for what we call the pre-tax subsidies. Those are interventions that interfere with market functioning, impede consumption efficiency, impede productive efficiency, impede investment and long-run growth. But the externalities are another matter, and from our introductory economics texts onward, we know that where there are externalities that are not dealt with, there is a role that the market will not play. And I think the problem the world now faces is that some of these externalities have turned out to be very material. And it's time to find a way to address them. We can have a long and good discussion about how to do it, whether there should be taxes partly with tax expenditures, cap and trade, et cetera, et cetera. That's a good discussion, but it's certainly an area where one has to go a bit beyond the markets. And let me end with one last point. I wanted to reinforce a point that perhaps I didn't make forcefully enough. I do think in some ways on the pre-tax subsidy subject, our report is pushing on an open door. I know I remember I was at the IMF in the 80s, in the Treasury in the 90s. This is a subject that has been a very hard subject to discuss with developing and emerging market countries. They have political reasons for doing things the way they do them. That is all changing. We had a meeting in Tokyo at the time of our annual meetings last fall with 35 or so African finance ministers. We had a discussion for 2 hours. Antoinette Saya, who's the head of our African department, presided. This was not a discussion where we lectured anyone. This was not a discussion where we had to say much of anything. This was not a discussion where ministers said, should we or should we not eliminate energy subsidies? This was a discussion, how should we do this? And countries like Kenya and Uganda, who had already done it, explained what they had done. Other countries explained what they wanted to do and talked about the challenges and the difficulties for the various reasons that we point out in the paper. The problems that arise from these subsidies. This is well understood, and in particular in Africa, the impediment to development that is the consequence of these subsidies is very much on people's minds, and I think we will see action on this subject.
That's great. Thank you all. It's a very ripe issue. As I've said the last few meetings, we'd like to have the first 3+ comments come from guests, not from IIE internal people. I see a gentleman right over there. If you're near the back, I suggest you go to the stand-up mic. We're going to try to circulate the hand mic in this part of the room. The guy who's making his way to the mic actually was first in line, and then the gentleman behind him. Please identify yourself. If you'd like to direct a question to any particular member of the panel, please go ahead. And please try to keep it on the topic of today's session. There's plenty of material here. Thank you.
Oda Aberdeen, the Capital Trust Group. We're an investment bank that works mainly in the Gulf and Middle East. My question is to David and to Andrew. If you take a look at Egypt today, which is the center of gravity in the whole region, they have short-term economic and financial problems. What smart subsidy policy would you advocate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term?
Good, tough, topical question. I believe we also have a representative of the Egyptian embassy here who I will not put on the spot. What?
This is a very pertinent question. First, I want to say that Egypt's subsidies, energy and other, have come to be about 8% of GDP in a country that up until the MENA Spring had a budget deficit that was about 8 or 9% of GDP. So this is a very material issue for Egypt. There are various political reasons. I will leave to others to dissect how the political system led to such large subsidies, but it clearly had to do with granting subsidies to placate a restive population. It is also the case that Egypt now has, in the course of its in the course of the kinds of changes that they want to bring, the need for resources in order to provide better health, education, and a modern infrastructure. Egypt needs, of course, as a political matter, to provide jobs for a young and growing labor force. Fortunately and interestingly, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is now the party of power, is very clear-minded that this is a subject that has to be tackled. They are, after all, a party that, or a group that is formed of many people who are not from the big business sector, but rather are small and medium businessmen. They understand the needs of a small and medium enterprise sector that needs to grow, and so they are willing to tackle this subject. They are up against all of the subjects that we talked about. How do you devise a system? How do you focus on the long-term goals? How do you communicate? How do you deal with the fact that there are, in Egypt as well as in other countries, much of the subsidization is, in the end of the day, benefiting the upper quintiles of the income bracket? How do you protect the poor, and so on and so forth? All I will say in giving a general answer is we are working with the Egyptian government on devising such a scheme, and the mantra I ended with is our mantra in having this discussions with Egypt, which is that we would rather that it be done in the right way rather than right away. They, of course, need to get started because they have a significant fiscal problem and balance of payments problem. And so there's the need that the first steps be big enough and significant enough that you can say what your objective is and what will be accomplished by saving those monies, what benefits people will get from reallocating resources from energy subsidization to other subjects. But it also has to be done in a way that is in sequence to be in line with increasing the energy supply and taking account of the need to support the poorest.
Okay, Andrew, did you want to respond? And I think Robin also wants to come in.
Well, I clearly agree with David since he oversees Egypt and discusses these issues every day. But just, I mean, in simple terms, we should be subsidizing things that actually have societal, economic, and environmental beneficial externalities, not things that actually have negative externalities. We also should be subsidizing things like cash transfers, which have been demonstrated to have a very positive role. One of the striking things about Volume 2 of this report, which is really, really worth reading, these are, I can't remember how many, 40-odd cases of reform. Some of them succeeded, some of them partially succeeded, some of them failed. Those that failed generally failed to address compensation for the poor. They failed to communicate well, and they failed to think through sequencing and fail. And that's what's, I mean, there's just a lot of lessons from that. I mentioned Indonesia as a positive example in 2005, but it was an extremely negative example 6 years earlier where they tried to do the same thing, and they absolutely didn't address any of those three, and so it failed badly.
Thank you. Robin, did you want to say something?
Just very briefly, it seems to me that the trick here is how do you divide between the needs of the poor in the street, because that really gets to political stability, and then you get, how do you divide them from the rent seekers who are benefiting from low energy prices?
Right, absolutely. And as the numbers from the fund report show, the rent seekers are big beneficiaries of this whole game. The gentleman at the back mic, and please, and then the microphone here, please.
Yeah, Adam, thank you, Peterson Institute. Thank you for the invitation. Certainly a good topic, and opens up a number of cans of worms. My name is Philip Yen. I'm actually the anchor of Biz Asia America here in Washington, D.C. for CCTV America. And my question is this: I'm thinking of the subsidies for consumers, and while personally I'm for efficient use of economic capital around the world and pro-market forces, the question is an odd one because, for example, if you had a son or daughter who was learning to drive and they asked you to buy a new car, the new car costs X. That's your subsidy. If the car were to double in price, your subsidy is now double, but it would make you think twice about providing that subsidy. So the question is, if there is a rise in commodity prices, would that further the effort for financial reform in this particular area? And if so, wouldn't the higher commodity prices ultimately have an adverse impact on GDP, which is also partially contrary to the initial belief that if we had financial reform, that would be generally good because it would be more efficient use of capital. A bit of an odd question, but anybody, please.
Thank you for pushing us a bit, Philip. Does someone on the panel want to respond? David?
No, I think it's a perfectly good question. I think we do see that subsidies are higher since energy prices, oil prices went up in a number of countries where there are very substantial reliance on oil price increases. When the government sets the price, it's hard to adjust the price. It becomes a politically conspicuous act to do that. I think in an odd way, you're right in your supposition. If the prices go up and governments don't dare raise prices, if world prices go up and governments don't dare raise prices, someone has to pay, and the ones who pay the difference is in the first instance the budget, which either means the taxpayers or ultimately, if there's inflation, the money holders. And we have seen countries pushed toward the edge of, into bad fiscal situations or maybe even to the edge of fiscal sustainability as they've allowed that process to go on. So there is the perversity, the perverse effect that the higher prices may well lead to a greater perception of the need to act. Of course, the risk is that countries don't act and crisis ensues, and I think that there are certainly some cases where that's a genuine risk.
Thank you. The gentleman in the front row here.
Yes, David Burwell from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I guess this is for David again. You're the man on the block here. I was intrigued by the size of the subsidy to U.S., $500 billion a year, and you had as components not only CO2 emissions but congestion, air pollution, and accidents. There's another subsidy I think you might have overlooked, which is the fact of building and maintaining the infrastructure itself. You know, we do have a deficit. We pay more for the maintenance and construction of the system. Two national commissions have identified that subsidy in terms of not paying the cost of the system itself and deferred maintenance at anywhere between $70 billion and $130 billion a year. Is that not an additional subsidy, consumer subsidy, that we're not, in fact, the user not paying, nor is the public in any way paying the cost of building and maintaining the system itself?
That's a complex subject. I mean, obviously we provide public goods and infrastructure and don't expect people to, I mean, people have to pay for the toll roads, but there are many parts of our infrastructure that are public goods, and it is being maintained through government expenditures. I think I would just flip it around and say I think there is an infrastructure need in the United States, and this just makes all the more important given the starting point, which is the budget deficit and debt issue in the United States, not to be allowing subsidization that leads to inefficiency or the lack of internalization of externalities, because the foregone dollar means inadequate infrastructure.
Thank you. Arvind, and then Karan, and then Fred.
Yeah, this is a kind of...
Identify yourself.
Arvind Subramanian from the Peterson Institute, and this is a kind of slight analytical challenge to the numbers, predicated on, if I understood Bill right, in terms of how the post-tax subsidies are calculated. So and I'm assuming that it's calculated on the basis that it's $25 per ton. If you don't meet that, that's a post-tax subsidy. If I were a Chinese or an Indian, I would challenge that on the following grounds. I would say that those externalities have two parts. One is the national externality, fine, and you calculate that. Then is the global externality. But for the global externality, who should contribute how much is a profound social and ethical question. And by actually saying everyone should be uniform on that, you've actually taken a stand by pretending it's completely technical. So I would say, for example, that perhaps it should be the subsidy by the US is even greater than what you're making out to be, if in fact the US should price carbon much more, and India and China, because they're poor, they didn't contribute as much, they should actually be contributing much less going forward. Then, and there the magnitudes could be quite substantially affected. Basically, it's a profound political and social and ethical question, which you've kind of not just ducked, but actually taken a stand on in a way that many would object.
Just because someone objects doesn't mean it's right, but you're right to raise it. So I see Andrew wanting to come out on this.
Yeah, others will have views on this. First, I think we have to separate the efficiency from the equity question. If we want to have efficiency, the people who use energy should pay what the marginal cost is, including the social cost. How we distribute the revenue, you could have a system where that happens, but those people are reimbursed. There could be transfers and so on and so forth. There is a long and complex question, which in a sense goes even beyond what you just asked, that was at the heart of the difficulties in arriving at the Copenhagen Accord, which is that, of course, much of the CO2 that has been emitted was emitted by industrial countries over a long period of time. And they have made the argument that one shouldn't look at when one's considering the equity question and the distributional question, shouldn't look at contemporaneous emissions. One should look in some way that reckons with the past. But there's I think the conceptual point, if you want an analytic answer, the conceptual point is that users should pay on the margin for the supply cost plus the externalities, and then the world conceptually should work out the incidence, who pays with some system of transfers. And that was a subject of discussion in Kyoto and in Copenhagen when one talked about how cap and trade and the various proposals for the funding of climate change mitigation were discussed.
Thank you. Andrew, did you want to add anything? Or?
Well, I was broadly going to say that the same thing. A ton of carbon, wherever it's emitted in the world, has the same negative impact today. And it's a clever point you're raising, but I don't think it's the right point. If, by the way, the argument is that China should have a lower shadow price of carbon, then, or a tax on carbon, then other countries, rich countries, have a much higher one than the $25. But you're quite right. There's going to be some very interesting discussions. I mean, one, for example, is shouldn't the emerging economies have actually a discount rate that is higher than rich countries, because the discount rate consists of the pure rate of time preference and then the expected rate of growth of consumption times the elasticity of that with regard to well-being, if you like, and they're going to be growing much faster. So they could make that case too. So I think there are going to be some very interesting economics brought into the negotiations.
Discount rate, so Bill?
No, I will resist. But I do think that this illustrates what I think is a bit of a sleight of hand in this study, which is it brings in global warming in a fashion that I do not think that the folks who pledged to eliminate all inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in Pittsburgh were committing. Now, if I'm wrong, I would like to be clarified on that. But this sort of issue precisely means that China did not sign on to $25 per ton of carbon when it signed on to this.
Yeah, no, and Arvin was right to get us there. Karan.
Thanks, Adam. Karan Bhatia with GE. David, first of all, great report, and thanks for the superb discussion. I was wondering if you could tie this at all to another topic that's been in the news here in D.C. a little bit as of late, and that's the subject of restrictions of exports of energy products, specifically LNG, which is very much in the news. I recognize it's not a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry, but nonetheless, my question, I guess, would be, do you consider this to be kind of within the subsidy debate? And regardless of whether you do or not, any thoughts on the appropriateness of what the right policy should be in that area?
Before David answers, I'll just give him a breathing space. I haven't done as many plugs as I usually do, but we have an excellent policy brief by Gary Huffbauer that came out a couple weeks ago arguing why the restrictions on exports of LNG is just as much of an offense in economic efficiency terms and precedent terms to free trade as any other one, and I encourage people to read that. But David.
I'll just refer people to Gary's study.
That works for me. I think I've only got one more question left, and wouldn't you know it, it's Fred Bergston.
Thank you, Adam. Congratulations to the fund, great study. Tough topic. But with all due respect, the study as presented and the discussion so far strikes me as Hamlet without the prince. You have extolled, particularly Robin and David, you've particularly extolled market-oriented policy changes to maximize efficiency and the like. But you've kind of ignored the fact that the energy market is kind of a peculiar market. I mean, there is at the heart of the, quote, energy market, the OPEC cartel, which has something to do with the level of world energy prices. Indeed, people who subsidize consumer demand in their countries have traditionally kind of thought that maybe the price was too high, in part because cartel behavior was determining the price, and therefore equity suggested an offset. Now, one may like or dislike the impact of OPEC. One may say, well, It's part of the real world, not much we can do about it anyway. But to kind of ignore it in a discussion of this type and use terminology like let's get market-oriented in everything we do strikes me as a little misleading, and I would ask you to respond to that.
Remember, Fred served in the Carter administration. Indeed, which decontrolled, and OPEC made a very big impression on the poor lad at the time. So would anyone care to agree or correct Fred's view on the cartelization of world energy markets? Robin.
It's interesting you raise that, Fred. Going back to North America and the impact of markets. The global oil markets are in a period of profound change. The Saudis are absolutely dumbfounded what's the surge in production in North America. But there's one, and I don't mean to bore people here, but there's a little pesky detail that nobody talks about when they talk about North America. It's called decline rates. And what's happened in North America is that production has surged, but it's from a really different kind of well. And so that you have smaller wells that decline very quickly. There are thousands of them. And what's going to happen is that as the price fluctuates, that production will fluctuate, because as the well declines, if the investment is justified, people will drill another well. If it doesn't justify it. So the structure of the markets is going to change dramatically. And I think Saudi Arabia and OPEC's ability to manage all of this is going to be challenged. So I concede, I still defer to the markets, Fred.
Would anybody else care to come in on this? No?
It was about the fund. So let me say, we are a financial institution, and as somebody who has to clear all the papers that get published, it feels like we're also a publishing company. But we are not Shakespeare. So this is neither Hamlet with or without the prince. I think that it's a good subject. It's just not the subject of this paper, and I think the role of OPEC, the evolution of the global oil market is a good subject, and if you're challenging us to look at it, it's a useful challenge.
Very nice. We actually, despite the wealth of material, do have 5 minutes left before our witching hour. If anyone else, yes, I see an outstretched hand. If you could move to the back mic, please.
Joe Marie Griesgraber, New Rules for Global Finance. I was trying to be polite and quiet, but there are 5 extra minutes.
You don't need to use all 5, Joe Marie.
No, certainly not. I did want to say that we're waiting for Chapter 2 or Volume 2 of your study when you look at subsidies for producers, which I think is a particularly sensitive issue in the United States, given the free federal lands that are so often used in the so I wait for that. The other thing is, it's kind of a niggledy-piggledy point, is in your charts when you have something labeled coal, natural gas, petroleum products, and then electricity, it seems like you're mixing categories. How do you get electricity without one of those things, except for nuclear or sun? So I think your charts are really need to be clarified somehow, because electricity is either, you know, a product like coal or gas, or it's a standalone product. It's confusing categories, that's all. It's a logic point.
Okay. You can take that.
I didn't hear a question mark, but I will just say we certainly appreciate the importance of looking at the production side more comprehensively. We did what we could do given the data that we had. I think the issue on the pie chart is that one could apply a subsidy to direct consumption of petroleum, of coal, of natural gas, or one could apply a subsidy at the level at which electricity is consumed, whether it was generated by one of the fuels, and we've made that distinction, but we can try and clarify that if need be.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for engaging with us on what is potentially a transformative topic and initiative. Thanks to Robin and to Andrew and to Bill. Thanks especially to David and his colleagues at the fund for giving us this opportunity to engage. as Arvind and others have pointed out, it may be a little more complicated than it seems, but it is kind of nice to at least think of a world in which one could do something about global poverty and global warming at the same time. And I think that's a very great aspiration to be doing, at least as an analytical basis. So thank you all very much.